In the glittering world of ancient Egypt, Cleopatra's name stands as a symbol of power, beauty, and intelligence. She's often portrayed as the seductress queen, the woman who captured the hearts of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, the last pharaoh who fought against the forces of Rome to protect her kingdom. But beneath the layers of grandeur, politics, and romance lies a far darker and more troubling legacy, a legacy shaped by the very family that gave her the throne. While history has celebrated Cleopatra's intellect and charm, it has seldom acknowledged the horrific legacy of incest that plagued her family for generations. The Ptolemaic dynasty, to which Cleopatra belonged, was infamous for its practice of marrying within the family, particularly between siblings. These incestuous marriages were not mere personal choices, but a tool of power and political survival, deeply embedded in the family's cultural and dynastic structure. What might seem like a mere oddity in royal practices was, in fact, the foundation of the power Cleopatra inherited and would eventually manipulate to her advantage. Her family's belief in keeping the bloodline pure and the insidious effects of this practice had dire consequences that would mould Cleopatra's life, her reign, and her relationships in ways that we're only beginning to fully understand. In this video, we will uncover the horrifying truths about Cleopatra's family, their incestuous practices, and the tragic legacy they left behind. These were not just the actions of a few despots, they were the actions of an entire dynasty whose pursuit of power came at the cost of human dignity. As we delve into the stories of Cleopatra's ancestors, her parents, and her siblings, we will explore how their twisted family dynamics shaped the course of Cleopatra's reign. What might have been the price of such a legacy, and how did it haunt one of history's most famous queens? The answers lie deeper than you may have ever imagined. The Ptolemaic dynasty, established after Alexander the Great's death, was a family rooted in both Greek and Egyptian culture, a blend that became central to Cleopatra's identity. But behind the outward appearances of opulence and power, the dynasty's survival rested on one unsettling tradition: incestuous marriages. This practice was not merely a peculiar habit, it was a political necessity. In a world where political alliances and royal bloodlines were essential for maintaining control, incest was seen as the best way to preserve the purity of the ruling family's lineage and to prevent foreign influence from diluting their power. It began with Ptolemy XII, one of Alexander's generals who, after Alexander's death, took control of Egypt and established the Ptolemaic line. He married his sister, Arsinoe I, to strengthen his hold on power and solidify his dynasty. This set a precedent that would continue for the next 3 centuries, with successive Ptolemaic rulers marrying siblings, cousins, and other close relatives in an effort to maintain the purity of the royal bloodline. Cleopatra's own parents, Ptolemy XII Auletes and his wife, were no exception. For the Ptolemies, incest was not just a personal choice but a political tool. It ensured that the bloodline would remain unchallenged, that their right to rule Egypt would be unbroken, and that the kingdom would stay under their control. The fear of losing power, particularly to outside forces, drove this dark tradition. But this incestuous practice, designed to secure their reign, did more than just keep the bloodline intact. It created a cycle of mental, emotional, and physical decay that plagued each successive generation. By the time Cleopatra was born, the Ptolemaic family was deeply entrenched in this tradition, and the effects were evident. While Cleopatra's political acumen and ability to navigate the dangerous waters of Roman influence would set her apart, she was still the product of a family whose sense of entitlement and dynastic power came at a tremendous human cost. The very bloodline that gave her the throne was also a symbol of its decay, a decay that would haunt her reign. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII Orleats, was a man whose reign was marked by weakness, deceit, and a lack of true power. Unlike the strong and charismatic rulers of Egypt's past, Ptolemy XII struggled to maintain control over his kingdom. His rule was defined by an inability to manage the growing threats from both internal and external forces, particularly Rome, whose influence over Egypt was becoming more dominant. In fact, his reign was a series of crises: political instability, poor governance, and relentless pressure from the Romans. Ptolemy XII's ascent to the throne was itself a result of cunning rather than strength. He was not the natural heir. His claim to the throne came through a series of backroom deals and manipulations. When he was exiled from Egypt, he used Roman influence to secure his return, solidifying his dependency on Roman power. This reliance on Rome would continue throughout his rule, leading to a series of compromises and humiliations that further weakened his authority in the eyes of his subjects. His reign was one of negotiation and subjugation, rather than leadership and respect. Ptolemy XII's personal life was equally dismal. His marriage to his sister, who was likely both a political necessity and a reflection of the Ptolemaic tradition of incest, did little to stabilize his rule. His inability to produce a strong and legitimate heir also put his dynasty at risk, creating uncertainty about the future of Egypt. His relationship with Cleopatra's mother remains a mystery, but it's clear that the family dynamics were complex, and Ptolemy's weakness only exacerbated the strained relationships within his household. It's likely that Cleopatra, watching her father's ineffectiveness and moral failures, grew up understanding the harsh realities of both power and the sacrifices made to preserve it. Ptolemy XII's reign ended in 51 BC, leaving Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII to inherit a kingdom that was already on the brink of collapse. But the damage had been done. His inability to break free from Roman influence and his failure to instill a sense of strength and purpose in his children left Cleopatra to face not only the political turmoil of her reign, but also the weight of her family's tragic legacy. Cleopatra's mother remains one of the most enigmatic figures in ancient history, with very little known about her. Some ancient sources suggest she was Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII's sister, and thus another part of the incestuous foundation of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Others suggest she might have been one of Ptolemy's wives, perhaps from a different branch of the royal family, but the details are unclear, leaving her identity shrouded in mystery. What is certain, however, is that Cleopatra's mother played a crucial role in the formation of Cleopatra's early life and political perspective. While historical records are silent on many aspects of her life, it is believed that she exercised a degree of influence over Cleopatra during her childhood and early reign, even if her physical presence is barely mentioned. Given the highly political nature of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra's mother likely played a key part in shaping her understanding of governance, power, and survival within the treacherous world of Egypt's royal court. If she were indeed a sister wife to Ptolemy XII, she would have lived a life shaped by the same political manipulation and familial deceit that defined Cleopatra's own existence. Regardless of her exact relationship to Cleopatra, her absence in the historical record speaks volumes. The Ptolemies' practice of incest meant that Cleopatra's mother was likely a product of the same familial dysfunction that affected all members of the dynasty. The pressure to maintain the royal bloodline, paired with the social and political manoeuvrings of the Ptolemaic court, meant that Cleopatra's mother would have lived in a world where survival depended on power plays, alliances, and personal sacrifices. What's clear is that the shadow of Cleopatra's mother hung over the young queen throughout her life. Whether or not she directly influenced Cleopatra's decisions, the lessons of survival, manipulation, and the dangers of power were likely passed down through whispered advice and subtle guidance. In a family so defined by its incestuous traditions and political deceit, the absence of a strong maternal figure leaves a dark void, a gap that perhaps Cleopatra would feel deeply as she navigated the complexities of her reign, alone to face the repercussions of her family's tragic legacy. Cleopatra's early life was inextricably linked to the dark legacy of her family's incestuous past. Born in 69 BC, she was the product of a royal bloodline that had long been tarnished by the corrosive effects of inbreeding and political manipulation. From the very beginning, Cleopatra's life was shaped by the dysfunction and instability that marked the Ptolemaic dynasty. Raised in the palatial halls of Alexandria, she was surrounded by opulence and luxury, but also by a court rife with intrigue, betrayal, and power struggles. Her world was one where survival was determined not by virtue, but by political alliances and the ability to manipulate those around her. As the daughter of Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra would have known early on that the throne was not a birthright but a prize to be fought for. While many young royals are groomed to rule with a sense of purpose and destiny, Cleopatra's upbringing was marked by the harsh reality that the very stability of her family was precarious. The constant threat of rebellion from within her family, combined with the increasing influence of Rome, meant that Cleopatra was forced to learn the rules of political survival at a young age. Cleopatra's education, though luxurious and extensive, was not merely about developing the mind of a ruler. It was about survival within a dynastic system built on corruption. Her studies would have been designed to mould her into a figurehead capable of maintaining her family's power, all while knowing that her true value lay in her ability to charm, manipulate, and navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics. She learned languages, philosophy, and the arts of governance, skills that would make her an intelligent and articulate leader. But the lessons of loyalty, family, and love were overshadowed by the harsh lessons of betrayal, manipulation, and deceit that were ingrained in the very fabric of the Ptolemaic court. Even as a child, Cleopatra understood that power was not to be trusted to those who were weak or morally pure. She would have witnessed firsthand how her father's inability to rule effectively left Egypt vulnerable to outside forces, particularly Rome. The relationship between Cleopatra and her father would have been complex, shaped by both the love for her parent and the realization that his reign was weak and unstable. The early exposure to her family's dark legacy, with its twisted use of power and disregard for human dignity, undoubtedly shaped Cleopatra into the shrewd and ambitious queen she would become. Cleopatra's relationship with her siblings was as much a political arrangement as it was a familial bond, shaped by the ruthless world of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Growing up in a family where power and survival were paramount, Cleopatra's ties with her siblings were marked by competition, betrayal, and the ever-present shadow of dynastic ambition. At the time of her father's death in 51 BC, Cleopatra was thrust into the volatile struggle for control over Egypt, a battle that would pit her against her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, and force her to navigate the treacherous terrain of sibling rivalry with deadly consequences. Her relationship with Ptolemy XIII was particularly complex. Though they were siblings, Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII were immediately thrust into a political marriage. In keeping with Ptolemaic tradition, Cleopatra was expected to marry her brother to maintain the purity of the royal bloodline. However, the marriage was more of a political necessity than a genuine familial connection. As often happened in royal families, the power dynamics between Cleopatra and her brother became increasingly strained. Ptolemy XIII, a mere child when he ascended to the throne, was under the influence of his advisors, who sought to maintain their control over the kingdom by keeping Cleopatra sidelined. The conflict between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII escalated quickly after their father's death. Cleopatra, determined to rule Egypt in her own right, took the bold step of asserting her authority. But her brother, encouraged by his advisors, resisted her efforts and sought to force her out of power. The court of Alexandria, already rife with factions and intrigue, became a battleground for their bitter rivalry. Cleopatra's position was precarious, caught between the political machinations of her own family and the growing influence of Rome, which was quickly becoming an unstoppable force in Egypt. The betrayal within the family was not just political, it was deeply personal. Cleopatra was forced to flee Alexandria after Ptolemy XIII's forces pushed her out, seeking refuge in the desert with a small group of loyal followers. This exile marked a turning point in Cleopatra's life, pushing her into the arms of Julius Caesar, whose involvement in her struggle for power would change the course of her reign and reshape Egypt's relationship with Rome. The conflict with her brother culminated in the famous Battle of the Nile, where Ptolemy XIII's forces were defeated by Caesar's army. Shortly after, her brother drowned in the Nile, cementing Cleopatra's control of Egypt, but also marking the tragic end of her sibling's life. Cleopatra's relationship with her siblings was a cruel reflection of the Ptolemaic dynasty's values, where family loyalty was undermined by the drive for power and where love was sacrificed at the altar of political survival. Even in victory, Cleopatra could not escape the consequences of this dark legacy. Her siblings' tragic fates were tied to the same system of incest, betrayal, and ruthless ambition that had shaped the dynasty for generations, leaving Cleopatra to carry the heavy weight of their actions as she ascended to the throne. Cleopatra's relationship with Julius Caesar was as much a political maneuver as it was a personal alliance, carefully crafted to secure her position on the throne and strengthen Egypt's tenuous independence from Rome. In a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse, with internal power struggles and the looming threat of Roman domination, Cleopatra understood that her future depended not just on her own skills, but on the favour of the most powerful man in the world. Julius Caesar, for his part, was drawn to Cleopatra not only for her legendary beauty, but for her intelligence, ambition, and determination to retain control of Egypt. Their meeting, which occurred in 48 BC, was both dramatic and strategic. Cleopatra, at the time locked in a fierce power struggle with her brother Ptolemy XIII, had been exiled from Alexandria. When Caesar arrived in Egypt following his conquest of Pompeii, Cleopatra saw an opportunity to win his support and secure her throne. In a move that has since become the stuff of legend, Cleopatra allegedly had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence wrapped in a rug, presenting herself as both the solution to Rome's interests in Egypt and as a ruler capable of outmaneuvering her rivals. Caesar, ever the shrewd politician, recognized that Cleopatra was not simply a woman of remarkable beauty. She was a woman with political savvy and an acute understanding of the power dynamics at play in Rome. He also understood that the instability in Egypt provided an opportunity for him to cement Roman influence over the region. For Cleopatra, Aligning herself with Caesar was a bold step towards securing her position, but it was also a step into the complex world of Roman politics, where alliances were fluid and loyalty was often fleeting. Their relationship, though filled with mutual respect and attraction, was deeply rooted in the need for political gain. Cleopatra's reign was precarious, and Caesar's backing provided her with the military strength and political legitimacy she needed to defeat her brother and reclaim her throne. In return, Caesar gained an ally who could help secure Roman interests in Egypt, ensuring a stable and subservient region that could be a valuable asset to his empire. However, the relationship between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar was not without its complexities. Cleopatra's decision to align herself with Caesar was not simply about love or personal affection. It was a calculated move to maintain control of Egypt and its resources, which were vital to Rome's expanding empire. For Caesar, the affair with Cleopatra was also political, but it was wrapped in personal admiration. His time with Cleopatra produced not only a son, Caesarion, but also a strong and mutually beneficial alliance that bolstered his standing in Egypt and cemented his influence in the region. As the relationship evolved, it became clear that Cleopatra was not content to simply play the role of Caesar's mistress. She was determined to be an equal partner, not a subordinate. This dynamic reflected her ability to manipulate the political currents of her time. Cleopatra understood that her strength lay in her ability to shape her own destiny, and in Caesar she saw not just a lover, but a powerful political ally who could help her achieve her ambitions. Despite their personal closeness, their relationship was always rooted in the broader scheme of empire building, with both Cleopatra and Caesar using each other as tools to strengthen their respective positions. In the end, Cleopatra's relationship with Julius Caesar was a masterclass in political manipulation. She knew how to navigate the complexities of power, using her charm, intelligence, and political acumen to forge an alliance with one of Rome's most powerful figures. But their relationship, while romantic, was always grounded in the ruthless world of politics, where survival was more important than love, and power was the ultimate prize. For Cleopatra, aligning with Caesar was both a personal and political triumph, a calculated move that would shape her reign and solidify her place in history. The tragic fates of Cleopatra's siblings were, in many ways, the inevitable consequence of a family bound by the destructive cycle of incestuous rule. Born into a royal family where power was perpetually contested and alliances were forged through blood rather than trust, Cleopatra's siblings paid the highest price for their family's quest for control. The Ptolemaic dynasty, built on a foundation of inbreeding, produced rulers whose grasp on reality and morality was often clouded by ambition, paranoia, and the corrosive effects of generations of incest. As a result, Cleopatra's siblings were not merely heirs to a kingdom, they were pawns in a deadly game of survival. Cleopatra's brother, Ptolemy XIII, was thrust into the position of co-regent when their father, Ptolemy XII, died in 51 BC. At just 10 years old, Ptolemy XIII was far too young to rule effectively, and his advisors soon took control, pushing him into direct conflict with Cleopatra. The young king's reign was marked by manipulation and betrayal within the royal court. Under the influence of his advisors, Ptolemy XIII sought to strip Cleopatra of her power and control, setting the stage for a fierce power struggle. His position was fragile from the start. His rule was dependent on the support of the court, and when Cleopatra rallied her supporters and aligned herself with Julius Caesar, Ptolemy XIII's position became increasingly untenable. The conflict between Cleopatra and her brother escalated, eventually leading to a military confrontation. Caesar, supporting Cleopatra, decisively defeated Ptolemy XIII's forces at the Battle of the Nile. Soon after, Ptolemy XIII was found dead, his body floating in the Nile, though it is unclear whether he drowned during the battle or was killed on Caesar's orders. Regardless of the specifics of his death, his tragic end symbolized the extreme consequences of the incestuous power struggle within the Ptolemaic family. Ptolemy XIII's life, marked by betrayal and conflict, was a direct result of the incestuous nature of his family's rule, which encouraged rivalry rather than familial solidarity. But the tragedy did not end with Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe IV, who had initially sided with Cleopatra's enemies, also suffered a cruel fate. Arsinoe's initial rebellion against Cleopatra's rule, during the time when Cleopatra was exiled from Alexandria, made her a significant political threat. She was eventually captured by Caesar's forces and paraded in Rome as part of Caesar's triumph. But the story of Arsinoe's downfall does not end with her capture. Despite her youth and her earlier opposition to Cleopatra, Arsinoe was seen as a potential rival, and her fate was sealed when Cleopatra ordered her execution in 41 BC, after she'd been exiled to the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Arsinoe's death at the hands of her own sister is one of the most heart-wrenching betrayals of the entire dynasty, a consequence of the constant jockeying for power that defined the Ptolemaic family. The lives of Cleopatra's siblings were defined by the toxic atmosphere of a royal family in which incest, betrayal, and power struggles were not only accepted but expected. Ptolemy XIII's tragic death and Arsinoe's execution are but two examples of the consequences of this dynastic corruption. The incestuous marriages and the internal family conflict created an environment where survival was a matter of political maneuvering and where familial bonds were secondary to the pursuit of power. The fates of Cleopatra's siblings serve as stark reminders of the price of dynastic rule, where the desire to maintain control often led to the brutal destruction of one's own flesh and blood. For Cleopatra, the tragic end of her siblings must have been a bitter reality to face. Though she emerged victorious, securing her throne with Caesar's help, the toll on her family was devastating. Her siblings were lost to power struggles, and their deaths highlighted the harsh reality of living in a dynasty where loyalty was fleeting and the price of betrayal was often death. The tragedy of Cleopatra's siblings was not just a personal loss, it was a reflection of the systemic corruption that plagued the Ptolemaic dynasty, a dynasty built on incest and violence, where even the closest family ties were not strong enough to withstand the pressure of political ambition. The death of Cleopatra in 30 BC marked the tragic and definitive end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line that had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. Her death, along with the fall of her kingdom, sealed the fate of the once great empire and put an end to the family's incestuous reign. Cleopatra's final days were marked by both personal loss and political collapse, as she found herself caught between the forces of Rome and the inevitable downfall of her family's power. After Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, Cleopatra had allied herself with Mark Antony, another Roman power player, in a bid to maintain Egypt's independence. Her relationship with Antony, while rooted in both love and politics, made her a direct enemy of Caesar's successor, Octavian. The rivalry between Antony and Octavian escalated into the final war of the Roman Republic, with Cleopatra's fate increasingly tied to Antony's. Their forces clashed in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, a decisive naval conflict in which Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was defeated by Octavian's forces. The loss left Cleopatra and Antony vulnerable, with their power shattered and their hope for victory destroyed. Following the defeat, the once mighty Queen of Egypt was forced to retreat back to Alexandria, where she faced her inevitable demise. Antony, in despair over the defeat and believing that Cleopatra had already taken her own life, fell on his own sword. He died in her arms, a tragic end for a man who had once been a towering figure in Rome. Cleopatra, devastated by Antony's death, chose to follow him into death rather than live under Octavian's rule. The details surrounding Cleopatra's death remain shrouded in mystery, but most ancient sources agree that she took her own life, possibly by the bite of an asp, though the exact method remains speculative. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt became a province of Rome, marking the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the beginning of Egypt's long subjugation to Roman rule. The kingdom that Cleopatra had fought so hard to preserve was no more. The Ptolemies, whose bloodline had once been pure and powerful, were no longer in control, and Egypt's independence was extinguished forever. Cleopatra's tragic end, coupled with the defeat of her family and the extinction of the Ptolemaic dynasty, was a fitting conclusion to a reign marked by political ambition, familial betrayal, and a relentless quest for power. Cleopatra's death not only signified the end of her personal reign, but also symbolized the collapse of the Ptolemaic family's legacy. Her dynasty, built on incestuous practices and dynastic conflict, had spiraled to a tragic conclusion. The once great rulers of Egypt, who had sought to preserve their power through incest and ruthless politics, were now gone, leaving behind a kingdom that would forever be part of the Roman Empire. The end of Cleopatra's life and the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty are a powerful reminder of how deeply family politics and power were intertwined in ancient Egypt. The legacy of Cleopatra and her family is forever tied to the consequences of their incestuous practices and political manipulations. Cleopatra, who is often remembered for her beauty, intelligence, and seductive alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, was the product of a dynasty whose foundation was built on incest and the relentless pursuit of power. The tragic fates of her siblings, the manipulation, the betrayals, and the internal family struggles all reveal a deeper, darker reality that shaped not just Cleopatra's reign but the very identity of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemaic dynasty, obsessed with maintaining the purity of its bloodline, perpetuated a cycle of incest that weakened the very core of its leadership. While the family may have initially believed that incest would preserve their power and secure their reign, it instead sowed the seeds of corruption and instability. Cleopatra's story is inextricably linked to this legacy, one of betrayal, manipulation, and sacrifice. As the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra's reign was shaped by the scars of her family's dark past, and her own struggle to maintain power was a reflection of the dynastic decay that plagued her ancestors. Her relationships, particularly with her siblings, were marked by political maneuvering, and the betrayal thus a constant in the royal court. The tragic ends of her brother Ptolemy XIII and her sister Arsinoe IV, both victims of the power struggles within the family, serve as reminders of the cost of dynastic ambition. Cleopatra, despite her intellect and political skill, could not escape the toxic legacy of her bloodline, and her eventual death at the hands of Roman power symbolized the final collapse of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The lasting impact of Cleopatra's incestuous family is not just confined to history. It raises uncomfortable questions about power, survival, and the price of maintaining royal authority. It challenges us to think about the ways in which family dynamics, when influenced by political ambition and a desire for control, can lead to destruction. Cleopatra's story serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the ways in which personal and familial struggles can reshape the course of history. Her legacy, though marked by greatness, is also a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of a dynasty built on incest, manipulation, and the relentless pursuit of power.